Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Madame Le Pen, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg TV. Let me ask you what you see as the way forward.
Well, the Prime Minister and his government have just fallen because of a budget that we felt was extremely bad for the country. A new Prime Minister will most certainly be appointed this evening, and he will form his government quickly. And we'll go back to the drawing board. That is to say, we'll work again on a budget that is likely to be able to renew France with growth, with the creation of wealth, without hitting the French people with a very French problem, which is taxes.
D'un mal très français qui est l'impôt.
You've asked yesterday, or you've said yesterday, that the President Macron does not need to resign. Why not?
En tout cas, ce que j'ai dit, c'est que la démission du président.
Well, in any case, what I said, that the president's resignation is a personal decision on his behalf and can only take place, in my view, when a political crisis takes place or an institutional crisis can find no other solution than the resignation of the President of the Republic. It is not the case for the moment. What I do wish, on the other hand, because for sure there will be new legislative elections in the next few months, is that we work on a voting system by then that enables us to have a real majority, whatever that majority may be. But the country needs a majority. It can't live for months and years with three blocs, which in reality can't implement a policy.
Would you resign if you were President of France today?
I would hope that I wouldn't find myself in Mr. Macron's situation, because after all, he is majorly responsible for this situation, because the results of Emmanuel Macron on an economic level are extremely bad. He introduced himself as being the Mozart of finance. But the reality is, when you look at the figures, when he came and the figures today, we're not even drifting, we're going down a slope. Whether we're talking about debt, just to remind you, in 2017, 2,200 billion of debt, now 3,300 billion of debt. Whether we're talking about industry, 9% of GDP in 2017, sorry, I meant 11% in 2017, 9% today, and the commercial deficit, 70 billion to 100 billion deficits that have increased in a spectacular way. We were at 2.6% of GDP in 2017. Now we're at 6.1%. So he has placed the country in such an appalling situation from an economic point of view that I don't really want to compare myself to him.
But this latest budget, and Monsieur Barnier was actually considered a very respectable, liked by the markets in terms of the budget, and he gave your party quite a lot of concessions.
Alors, bon, d'abord c'est faux et c'est pas le sujet.
Well, first of all, that's wrong, and that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that we can't consider, and I can't imagine the markets consider, that a good budget is a budget, when in fact we have record taxation within Europe that increases taxes by another 40 billion, and that 4 billion of extra taxes on companies is good news at a time when we had 65,000 companies going out of business. That is to say, a record last year, at a moment when unemployment is increasing again, and once again there are 260 redundancy plans throughout the country. And the budget was bad, and not only did it give rise to enormous extra taxes, but there were no savings as far as the state was concerned.
Il créait encore une fois des impôts considérables supplémentaires, mais en plus il ne faisait aucune économie sur le train de vie de l'État. Or, on voit bien que l'éléphant dans la pièce...
The elephant in the room, if you will, is the state's toxic spending, which carries on going up and up and up. Linked first of all to a multitude of waste, thousands of agencies, various institutes, which of course cost a fortune. And then, of course, linked to immigration. Let's be clear about things. When there are 500,000 people that are coming into our country per year, and only 10% have got a work contract, how do we expect our social security system to take on this considerable weight of people who, for 90% of them, will not participate to the creation of wealth?
Pour 90% d'entre eux ne participent pas à la création de richesse.
But when you do the numbers, what can you promise the markets in terms of deficit? So this latest budget proposal meant the deficit would be 5% of GDP next year, and then 3% in 2029. Do you promise similar numbers?
Mais je pense que les marchés
Well, I believe the markets would be right not to be contented simply with promises, especially when the promises can't be kept. Because after all, the major difficulty in this area is that we've got to be able to make structural savings with regard to the functioning of the state, but at the same time recreate the conditions for wealth. That is to say, reindustrialization, to act on aspects that are essential, like, for example, the cost of energy, because after all, it's the cost of energy which is really the key to all of this. And we mustn't strangle the economy.
Si vous voulez aller trop vite, mieux vaut une trajectoire, je crois, qui soit une
If you want to go too fast, you've got to have a trajectory that's a reasonable trajectory based on the creation of wealth and structural savings, rather than saying, you will see we're going to reduce the deficit by 2 points over 3 years. And in fact, you're doing things that are so appalling that people no longer spend money and they save too much. There is no longer any investment and the economy collapses. And so, we don't want to submit to deficits. It's been 50 years that we've been passing budgets with chronic deficits. We no longer want to be in that modus operandi. We want to reabsorb the deficits, but we want to do it intelligently, without depriving us of the chance to reindustrialize, to be able to help companies, to count on them, to create wealth, and therefore to also create employment and to make young people work. Because after all, that's also the central problem. Because if young people don't work, then social protection systems will be unbalanced. So all of those aspects are equilibriums that we have to try to find.
So in terms of numbers, 3% of GDP in 2029 is far-fetched?
Arriver à 3% de PIB en 2029.
Getting to 3% in 2029, I don't think it's credible. But I'm not the only one. I don't think it's credible either to the president of the Cour des Comptes, state auditor. Once again, these are simply promises, and they know very well that they can't keep to them. Mr. Barnier made that promise, and in reality, his budget worsened the deficit by 12 billion. So if we don't make significant, intelligent, structural savings with regard to the state, and if we don't put in place the conditions so that companies can work, invest without being suffocated with extra taxes, we won't get there. But with those two solutions, we can succeed as quickly as possible to get back to a reasonable deficit, even if the 3% was just decided on the back of an envelope.
Même si 3%, ça a été décidé sur un coin de table, on le sait.
How fast could that be?
C'est l'affaire de quelques semaines.
Well, it's a matter of weeks. We'll discuss it with the new Prime Minister. We'll work together. We'll explain what our red lines are. Our red lines are we can't ask the French people to pay the bill for the mistakes of their leaders. That's what Mr. Barnier did. He massively increases taxation, he hits sick people, retired people, he hits everyone. And at the same time, once again, there's zero savings from the state, and that's inadmissible.
Et parallèlement, zéro économie, encore une fois, sur le train de vie d'État. Ça n'est pas admissible.
Who would you like as Prime Minister?
C'est pas à moi de choisir.
Oh, it's not for me to choose. That really is the role of the President of the Republic. It's his responsibility. And I don't really care about the name. I care about the method. I want the Prime Minister to respect all the political forces that are represented at the National Assembly. It's quite simply called democracy.
What can President Macron do today for your voters?
Partir.
Leave. Well, no, there isn't a solution. Emmanuel Macron will never do very much in reality, and he's not going to give up on what he's been doing for 7 years. He's destroyed everything. He's destroyed everything in 7 years.
Il a tout détruit. Il a tout détruit en 7 ans. Il a détruit ce qui fonctionnait dans notre État.
He destroyed what used to function in our state, the prefectural, etc. He destroyed France's load-bearing walls. He's caused massive deindustrialization. He's crushed the French people with taxation. He's done everything he wasn't supposed to do. So I'm not going to, for example, have any hope that tomorrow he'll be able to do absolutely the opposite of what he's done over 7 years. Now, once again, we will have to make do as long as he's there by hoping that the Prime Minister will be more reasonable than he is.
Encore une fois, on fera avec le temps qu'il sera là, et en espérant qu'un Premier ministre soit plus raisonnable que lui.
And not even a referendum on immigration would make a difference?
Il pourrait le faire, il pourrait faire un référendum sur l'immigration.
He could have a referendum on immigration, but he won't do it because, after all, he said, I'm prepared to do a referendum on every subject apart from immigration. So it's kind of a taboo that we can't understand the justification for. Because it's obvious that immigration that is totally out of control, like we're living through, is not only a problem as far as our public finances are concerned. It's also a problem in terms of the consequences it has with regards to the explosion of delinquency. So I don't think he'll ever touch immigration.
Vous voyez que l'immigration, à mon avis, n'y touchera jamais.
But why not ask him to leave then before 2027, even if the institutions say otherwise?
Mais parce que lui demander de démissionner, ça voudrait dire...
Well, because to ask him to resign would mean to disturb our institutions. Once again, it's his decision. Now, if there is a political crisis, an institutional crisis, and if he can no longer dissolve the assembly, if reshuffle serve no purpose, then the French constitution only leaves one other option, which is his resignation. But that wouldn't be a drama either. There would be new presidential elections. General de Gaulle, you know, designed our institutions, and they are very solid. They are extremely solid. Everything's done to make sure that the life of the nation can carry on and not create disturbances that can't be dealt with. If he were to resign now, there would be new presidential elections and new legislative elections.
Insurmontable. S'il démissionne, eh bien, il y aura de nouvelles élections présidentielles, des nouvelles élections législatives.
But are you worried about these crises then leading to severe market reactions?
Mais non, parce que la réalité, c'est que ce qui inquiète les marchés, c'est...
No, because the reality is that what worries the markets is the economic situation in France. What worries the markets is the lack of perspective concerning reducing deficits. It's the absence of savings at the state level, the increase of taxation on companies that worries the markets. And in fact, you've seen the markets have remained extremely stable over the past few days since the announcement of the no-confidence vote, and even after the no-confidence vote. In reality, they had concerns at the moment of the dissolution in June. But for the moment, whether it's the spread between France and Germany, the rates, or the markets, for the moment, everything is relatively calm. Because once again, they realise that anyway, there has to be at all cost another policy other than that envisaged by Mr. Barnier.
Parce qu'encore une fois, ils sont conscients qu'il faut à tout prix, de toute façon, une autre politique que celle qui avait été envisagée par M. Barnier.
But the market is probably looking at the fact that the ECB is standing close and that there's a want from France of getting the deficit down pretty quickly.
Non, oui, mais encore une fois, entre la volonté et les faits...
Well, yes, but once again, there's a long way to go between wishes and reality. Mr. Barnier wanted to reduce the deficits. He's increased them by 12 billion. You see what I mean? So, once again, using a hammer to bash French people over the heads with taxes, when we're the country with the highest rate of taxation in Europe, is not the solution. But it's the only solution that French leaders have implemented for years. It doesn't work.
Les dirigeants français mettent en œuvre depuis des années. Ça ne fonctionne pas. La preuve, regardez dans quelle situation nous sommes.
Look at the situation that we find ourselves in. So help companies, enable them to do business, reduce production tax, reduce the cost of energy, or at least reduce it to the same level as the cost of production in France. Those are things that will allow companies to develop and thus create employment.
Ce sont des lignes qui vont permettre aux entreprises de se développer et donc de créer de l'emploi.
But Madame Le Pen, I mean, first of all, the Barnier actually proposal means that GDP would be the deficit of GDP would be 5% in 2025 compared to 6% this year. So it's going down.
Non, il augmentait de 12 milliards le déficit.
No, the deficit rose by 12 billion. The deficit rose by 12 billion. But you know, the head of Safran, which is a major company, has just given an interview. And what did the head of Safran say? He said Barnier's budget is a bad budget. So, in reality, the fact that it's last year's budget that's applied, however unfair it was socially, is actually rather good news for companies. There are a certain number of entrepreneurs in economic circles who are in fact pleased about the no-confidence motion because they consider Mr. Barnier's budget was worse than last year's budget, and that's saying something.
Pire que le budget de l'année dernière, c'est pas peu dire.
Will you meet Trump when he's here for the reopening of Notre Dame on Saturday?
Well, I won't meet with him, but maybe we'll bump into each other because I will indeed be there too, at the reopening of Notre Dame, which is a major event for us in France. I don't have any relationship with Donald Trump. I will have one, I hope, the day I become President of the Republic.
You have a trial against you that will decide whether you can run for president. We're expecting that outcome on the 31st of March. will Jordan Bardella be, of course, candidate for presidency if you cannot present yourself?
Moi, je me mets pas dans la situation d'être empêché par la justice.
I don't place myself in that situation of being prevented from being a candidate by the justice system. I think that in any country, it's not acceptable to stop a candidate from representing themselves. And therefore, I don't think about that situation. I hope that the magistrates will respect the will of the voters to be able to choose their candidates. I have an African friend who sent me a text after the raids carried out against me and said, look, Marine, there are some countries where people don't have the right to vote, and there are countries where candidates aren't allowed to stand for election. In fact, I prefer countries where people can vote and candidates can stand for election.
Has it changed your thinking in actually, dealing with the budget?
Absolument pas. No.
Absolutely not. It has nothing to do with it. In fact, I don't see the relationship between the two. No. My only compass is the interests of the French people, the interests of our companies, and the future of my country. That's the only compass I've always had and will ever have.